Professor White, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me start right away with the first question. In your articles, you describe Turkish political life as a horizontal topography of action rather than a vertical model of oppression and resistance. How does this framework help us better understand Erdogan's consolidation of power post-2016 coup attempt?
Well, I think of politics both in micro terms and over the long term. So if you think of politics as just what's happening now, then you can try to clarify who's on top and who's on the bottom. But if you look at it, even in just a slightly longer time frame, you see that the constituents of up and the constituents of down don't stay the same. That they, especially in a place like Turkey, where it's almost like a roller coaster, for a long, as you know, for a long time in the 20th century, the sort of secular Kemalists were up, and they were able to, or they tried to determine how the rest of the population should live according to their standards, and lots of people went along with that because they also agreed with it. And those that didn't were, the religious, the peasants, they also lived in Turkey and they tried to do well for themselves. But they often found that being religious or being from the countryside was a drawback in terms of moving ahead. And to the extent that at some point, I think it was in the 60s, you were not allowed to wear a headscarf in a civil service job or even to visit someone in a hospital, if it was a state hospital, and then eventually you weren't allowed to wear a headscarf to go to university. So, that to many people who had been left out of the sort of nation, the sort of national progress idea of national progress, that was sort of the ultimate insult, that not only were they kept out because they were peasants or had migrated to the city and were considered to be kind of polluting the city, but also they weren't allowed to continue acting out their religion if they wanted to participate in this modern society. So there was this profound sense of being disenfranchised, being oppressed by the elites who at the time were trying to raise everyone up. So depending on where you're looking from, I mean, it's determined by the observer. What's the position of the observer to make this determination as to whether someone is oppressed or oppressor. So then, of course, as you know, the 80s came around and the Islamist Party started winning local elections and then national elections. And they represented these people who had been disenfranchised. And so then they came to power. Now we have the AKP. And then the AKP, in turn, decided to impose on the population their view of how one should live. It's a different part of the population, right? So, and again, depending on who's the observer, you can either feel oppressed or you can say those are the oppressors. But it's a roller coaster. Who's on top and who's not? Then if you take it down even another micro notch, you look at people who otherwise are the same, like the followers of Fethullah Gülen and the members of the AKP and before that the Refah Party, sort of lower middle class, merchant, not really merchant, but sort of business people. And later on they became wealthy, and the elites themselves. But the majority were sort of lower middle class people who had managed to get a step up in the new 1980s economy and were emboldened by the Islamist parties coming to power, and felt really now they're on top. And the Fethullah Gülen followers were, heavily involved in all of this. They worked together with the government and had their own version of what they were doing. But they were in many ways culturally and religiously, in terms of piety, indistinguishable from the AKP followers, right? So you would think that wouldn't be differentiated then, but they fell afoul of the AKP and became, if you have a bottom, they became the bottom. They were hounded out of existence, declared terrorists, and the scary thing for a lot of people was that you couldn't actually know who was in, who was out, who was up, who was down, because your neighbor, you wore a headscarf, your neighbor wore a headscarf, you're culturally identical, you've known each other for years. How do you know who is on the up and who is on the down? And there was also a culture of snitching, where if you didn't like your mother-in-law, you could snitch and say she's a Gulenist, and then see her fall. So this is not the usual up and down scenario, which has roots, I think, in a sort of liberal leftist view that the world is divided into people who are oppressed, the poor, the minorities, and then the oppressors, when in fact it's the oppressors themselves can oppress themselves. It's much more complicated than that.
Right. In your analysis of spindle autocracy, you argue that personal loyalty to a leader has replaced institutional merit. How has this dynamic reshaped Turkey's political institutions and public trust in them since the executive presidency was introduced?
Thank you, Selcuk. That's a good question, but all I can think of is the US right now. This is so applicable. You can see the spindle forming. Just the idea of the spindle autocracy or spindle politics, as I ended up calling it, is that you move from being a country where people look at the politicians and they may like or not like the politician, but they look at the policies. I like the policies of this politician. Two, I like this politician. I love this politician because this is, incredible outpouring of emotion, a passionate emotion that's much more than you like your politician. And I don't really care what his policies are. I go with them because they're things that he wants us to do. So that's an enormous difference. And the implications of that are also enormous, because if you have a political leader who is a spindle autocrat, who surrounds himself with people who are loyal as the first criterion, whether or not they're competent shouldn't be beside the point, but often is. In the Kemalist era, you've always had a kind of big man authoritarianism in Turkey, starting with Ataturk, the love of the leader. Ataturk is the loved leader throughout, but whenever individual Menderes, Demirel, Özal, and so on, there was this feeling of attachment to particular leaders. Also on the left, the leftist leaders, who are now sort of icons. So I'm not saying this is something new with AKP. They're old habits of power. Big man autocracy, authoritarianism, all of this is wound up with a kind of patriarchy, the Devlet Baba, the state as your father, which is now personalized as Erdogan as your father figure. Intolerance of difference. People don't like things that are different, people who are different. This has all been here all along in Turkey. So But what is different now is the character of this central leader, right? The styling, the other thing that's been around for a long time is the styling, the leader styling himself as a hero, and also as a victim, the heroic victim who's there to take care of you like a father. So Erdogan embodies all of this, as did the leaders before him. But the difference is that he has sort of forgotten the part where he takes care of the family. It's almost like it's become a purpose in itself to remain the leader. And then all the pomp and circumstance and the activities surrounding the presidency now just feeds resources, feeds attention to the central person. There's really no there are no institutions anymore around Erdogan that would have some kind of competence aside from having loyalty to him. I mean, obviously not everyone is incompetent, but Erdogan has kicked out anyone who he has thought was disloyal. And this happened after, it actually started happening in the late 2000s. There was a point where the Gülen movement, which was heavily represented in the police, I remember they went after some of Erdogan's family for corruption. And they also arrested the government's emissary who was going to Europe to try to organize a peace deal with the PKK at the time. And they didn't like that, so they arrested him when they came back. And it caused this kind of clash between the government and the government. These people were part of the government institutions. And so the Gülen movement was singled out. So the Erdogan's government singled out the Gülen movement and started to attack it. And then I think it's almost like a feud. It was back and forth attacks. And then the culmination in the 2016 failed coup attempt. So these were the people who had surrounded Erdogan at the beginning, right? And so they were down, they moved down on the roller coaster. And the people who moved in were not necessarily people known for their competence in things.
Right.
Yeah. So one of the big consequences of having a system like this is that nobody can disagree with the leader. If you disagree with the leader in a normal political situation, even in an authoritarian situation, you have advisors, right? They can discuss things with you and disagree. And but in this case, because the relationships are all personal, it's a personal relationship of loyalty and passionate love to the leader. You cannot disagree. If you disagree, you are a traitor. So hain, traitor, is another word that is kicked around quite a lot in Turkey. And even though it's used quite a lot, it's always taken very seriously. So if you're labeled a traitor in the newspapers, you could be arrested. Right? It's not something that's said for fun, but traitors are, every minute traitors are born because people will disagree with what the leader is doing, and then they get on the roller coaster and they go down. So it's a very unstable system, even though it looks like it should be stable because you have this strong man, right? The strong man system, but if you look closer at the micro level, there are always people kind of, if you think of the spindle, for those of you who don't know, a spindle is this sort of stick on a string that twirls, and then you take raw wool and you spin it there until it turns into yarn that you can knit a useful sweater with. So you think of the wool, the raw wool coming from the sheep, as a kind of the recruits, right, who
Right.
get involved around, who get into the orbit of the spindle, the leader.
Right.
And in doing so, they network, right? They become terbiyeli in Turkish, sort of both obedient, so terbiye, and you use it in cooking for when something is kind of done. So they get cooked in, and then if as the inevitable breakups happen, they split off. So even though it looks stable, you've got this leader who is always there, and if you look back in time, what you see are lots of spindles, names of spindles of leaders, but what you don't see is what was going on around the spindle, the people moving in and moving out.
Right.
Yeah,
You
so just as
you note that Erdogan's regime revived the threat paradigm once used by Kemalists, but with updated targets like Gülen movement. How do these manufactured inside-outside enemies influence popular support and the regime's legitimacy?
okay, so I think it's something that is deeply embedded in Turkish educational system. So children learn from a very early age that they're enemies. And in the Kemalist days, that was quite overwhelming. And the enemies, where there's a whole list of them, foreigners, the inside enemies, that is the non-Muslim minorities who, because they're not Muslim, can't possibly be loyal to the Turkish state and are probably working together with non-Muslim or Christian outsiders to undermine Turkey, as they had done in World War I. Some people call it the Sèvres syndrome. So this is like a serious thing that has infected the population through partly through the educational system, but also through the media. It's always represented. It's there in all the the what is it, the soap operas, even the Ottoman soap operas. It's in there somewhere. This distrust of non-Muslim foreigners, especially Christians. So, but it takes, again, on a micro level, it takes different forms, right? So I'm just thinking of an example of, so one of the biggest threats, according to the Turkish military, to Turkish national unity in the 1980s and early 90s, I believe, was missionaries, Christian missionaries. It was like there are almost no missionaries in Turkey. Well, why would this even be a thing, and much less one of the biggest threats to national unity? It's because it's not really the missionaries per se, even though some of them were actually killed as a result of that, attacked by people. It's a symbol of a Christian West that is out to destroy Turkey. It's what people believe. And you could be Jewish, and you could be gay, you could be any one of the many categories of other, and still be lumped in, or Armenian, right? So those are all kind of insults, if they're used in this way, as someone who is out to get Turkey, and they're interchangeable, right? So it's not the particular people or the particular category that's a threat. It's the fact that there is this threat. It's existential, and the category that belongs in the threat is constantly fungible. So you don't ever hear about missionaries anymore. It's as if that never happened, even though it was a serious thing for many years. Now you hear about Syrians, or the Gülenists. That's another new threat category. And they're even the worst threat because they're the threat within who are also Muslim and who look just like you. So, you know, it's a way to polarize the population, and in polarizing the population and polarizing the other political parties, because everybody feels like they have to take a stand on these things. So for many years, the CHP, the big opposition party, you know, was in step with everybody else in demonizing the outside enemy and the inside enemy.
Right.
Now they've moved away from that. Okay, but they still were, then they got on the bandwagon that everybody else was on of saying that of saying bad things about the Syrian refugees, or the Kurds. You know, now there's an attempt by the AKP to reach out to the Kurds in a way that I'm not sure it's believable, because nothing has been given the Kurds in return for Öcalan's speech, you know, or request that the PKK lay down its arms. But what it does is it splits the CHP, it splits the Kurdish party, the Dem party. It's like, are they going to support the CHP candidate for president, or are they going to sit it out and see whether they can get anything in return from the AKP for having for what Öcalan said, right? So it's not really a matter of fearing. It's a matter of using fear to create division. And division is always useful in politics.
Right, right. How would you characterize the current political regime in Turkey following the arrest of Ekrem Imamoglu? Has the country now fully crossed the threshold in the competitive authoritarianism, or something more consolidated?
I think they've been in competitive authoritarian for a long time now. You know, competitive authoritarianism is when you have elections that are competed in, like CHP competed, other parties competed, but it's not a level playing field. So the 90% of the media in Turkey are owned by pro-government businesses. So if there's an election, the CHP can get, maybe if they're lucky, a couple of minutes on TV, whereas the rest of it is all AKP all the time, right? So they're not allowed to put up posters there. So it's not a level playing field, but it's competitive because you could still win. It's possible against all odds, the giant odds, that you could win, as Imamoglu did. Right? And then, of course, we know that, was it 2018? No, I'm sorry, I'm bad at dates, but the local election that Imamoglu won, and then Erdogan decided he didn't like the result, so he had it rerun. And then Imamoglu won with an even much greater number of votes. So it is possible, right? Now, if you arrest Imamoglu, and there's been talk of putting a qayyum, or taking the government, basically taking over the CHP, as you know, replacing its leader with its own people, its own trustee, government appointed trustee. Then there's no more competition, right? That's it. So it's not. It's a competitive authoritarian state if there's no more competition.
Right, right. Erdogan's authoritarian turn
Autocracy.
Erdogan's authoritarian turn has evolved in phases over the past 2 decades. What would you say distinguishes this current phase from earlier moments of democratic erosion, such as post-Gezi or post-2016?
Yeah, you know, I was doing research in Turkey at the time that the AKP was elected, so I did a lot of work with the previous parties, but when they were first elected, it was a completely different scenario. You know, Erdogan was there was a lot of talk about what kind of Islam. It's a personalized Islam. You know, we're practical. We make decisions on a practical basis, and the fact that we're pious Muslims at home doesn't, you know, we bring our ethics to the office, but we don't make decisions on the basis of Islamic ethics. So that was the beginning, and also he reached out to non-Muslim minorities. There was a sort of progression, you know, which really heartened people that finally we have, you know, something, a different way of doing things, you know, that it's not always whoever is at the top, you know, will just make everybody be like them, follow their lifestyle, their ethics. That perhaps we can have some kind of pluralism, but it didn't last very long. The first thing that happened was, as I mentioned before, the attempt by the police to arrest people in Erdogan's close circle for corruption. And this is an important point where things turned, right? Because his response was to basically co-opt the judicial system. He moved judges to, you know, the far ends of the earth, where they wouldn't be able to do anything. He fired prosecutors, lawyers. He replaced, I think there was something like 5,000 new lawyers that came in that he replaced lawyers with, you know, so people who were in his pocket, you know, attached to the spindle, being spindled in. And so now you don't really have a free judicial system as we see all the time. It happened also during the, you know, with the people accused of being FETÖ, the Gülen members, once it was turned into a terrorist party. That the fact that, you know, people were brought in who didn't really have any connection with Gülen, but nevertheless went through the process, had their passports confiscated. To a large extent also, they were almost social pariahs. You know, people didn't want to be, even their families, you know, sort of abandon them because they were afraid they would get sucked in. And they many of them lost their businesses. They were taken over by the state.
Yeah.
Lost their social security. They became non-people, even though there was no judicial process, no reliable judicial process that proved anything.
Right, right.
Right. So then it just continued down that course. And I think the change had to do with a reaction, a fear on the part of Erdogan that he was going to be overthrown. You know, if you remember, there was also Tahrir Square and so on. And so when Gezi happened, you know, he assumed it was the same thing. And then, of course, there was 2016, an actual coup attempt. So I think all of this has to do with fear of falling, if you will. You know, it's the fear that he will be deposed. And so he is going to do, so as long as he could keep getting elected, which he did because he was still very popular, that wasn't really a problem. But now he's not so popular because the economy has, you know, has been terrible over many years, thanks in part to his kind of voodoo economics. And people, of course, many people are very, very wealthy, you know, also as part of this system. But the majority of Turks of whatever kind are now at the bottom of the roller coaster. Even if they're not arrested, they're just barely managing to stay alive, right? So I think his popularity is down to such an extent that he knows that if he went up against a candidate like Imamoglu, he would lose.
Right. This is the next question, actually, Professor. Many observers see the arrest of Imamoglu as a preemptive strike against opposition in the lead up to 2028 elections. Do you see this as a sign of regime insecurity or confidence?
Oh, absolutely, insecurity. Yeah, which makes it much more dangerous because this is a line that has been crossed now. You know, that if this stands, if Imamoglu, who is the candidate for the CHP, otherwise he wouldn't have been targeted like that, and who would have won or who would win in an election, if he is arrested and taken out of politics, and especially also if the party is taken over, then voting means nothing. So, you know, Erdogan since the beginning has been so proud of being the voice of the people. You know, I am the voice of the people. So he's proud of having you know, popular support. People love me. I'm again thinking of the US here. You know, the size of the crowds matters. Um, so the fact that he can no longer rely on that means, well, first of all, it means that he knows he can no longer rely on that. There's no getting the people back in his, you know, for his popularity, unless a miracle, an economic miracle happens. So the other option is to not have an election. If you can't win it, don't have an election. But that's, for Turkey, that's a huge step. May not be such a big step in other societies that don't have such a long history of elections, of free elections. But as far as I know, you know, for years, I've noticed that Turks are so proud of having elections that work, right? Of being able to elect or diselect their leaders. And it means a lot to Turks. It's not something, you know, that they could do without. So I think that's reflected now in the streets, you know. But just to say that there are many people who are not in the streets, mostly young people in the streets. And young people have nothing to lose. You know, they really have nothing. You know, they have no future under this government, under this regime, where you almost have to know someone in the party to be able to get a job, a good job, even if you have, you know, a good education. So something like 50% of young Turks want to leave the country. And this was from a couple of years ago. I saw a survey that showed that they went back to see party affiliation, and it turns out that a lot of those people, those young people, are AKP affiliated. So even the AKP youth want to leave because there's so little future for people.
Right.
So let me put it this way: they have nothing to lose. Their parents have a lot to lose because over 20 years, the AKP has infiltrated so much of Turkish economy and society that so many people's livelihood depends on belonging to the party or supporting the party. If you, whether you're working as a you know, a civil servant, or whether you are just one of the women hired to rake the grass, you know, as a kind of charity activity, you know, that given out by the municipality, to earn a little bit of money. I mean, at every single level of interaction between the state and the citizen, the AKP is present. They have also co-opted a lot of the civil society. So the fear that people have is quite realistic, that if the AKP falls, if Erdogan loses the election and the CHP becomes the party in power, what will happen to me? Right? Will I still have a job? Will they come in and do the same as everybody else, which is replace all of the old people with their new people? And for people, especially the poor people who are just barely hanging on, it's an incredible risk.
Right.
So I think you can't, you know, Erdogan still has a lot of people following or people willing to vote for him, but not necessarily because they're passionately in love with him.
Right.
Right.
And lastly, Professor White, how might the return of Donald Trump to the US presidency influence Erdogan's authoritarian behavior? Would it embolden similar tactics and reduce external democratic pressure on Turkey?
I think it already has. Apparently, this wasn't officially registered, but apparently they had a phone call. Erdogan and Trump had a phone call just a few days before I arrested Imamoglu. So I'm practically sure that Trump just said, "Oh yeah, go ahead, no problem." Why would he have a problem with that? So this sense of impunity has empowered authoritarians around the world. So Erdogan also has nothing to fear from US censure that they'll somehow go after him because of his human rights record or arresting political opponents. I mean, I'm sure Trump is all in favor of that. In the European Union is in a different situation. But it also has to do with Trump, because now that Trump is withdrawing from the US's obligations toward Europe, defense, and also the traditional relations, economic relations, Europe doesn't have to, but I think it's smart of Europe to see how important Turkey is for European defense in NATO. And also perhaps in other ways, that if you're not going to have the US on your side anymore, you have to turn somewhere else and make your own networks, strong networks. And Turkey will always be a very strong part of any network like that. So Europe, but also is in a position where, even though they care about human rights and they care about Imamoglu, because he represents to them a kind of liberal, democratic future, they're not in a position to say anything very strong about it, because they need Turkey also. And Turkey also has this very strong situation in Syria now. So it's a good moment for Erdogan to do this if he's going to do it.
Right. Professor White, thank you so much for your time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it.